What if I told you that, according to Schopenhauer, suffering is not an accident of life, it is part of life itself? We spend our entire lives wanting something. When we finally get it, we feel relief for a little while. Then a new desire appears, and then another, and another. It is as if we are trapped in a cycle that never ends. But does living necessarily mean suffering? Is happiness just a short break between two moments of pain? Or is there a way to escape this constant feeling of dissatisfaction? In this video, we will explore the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer, one of the most provocative thinkers in history, to understand why he saw life in such a harsh way, and more importantly, what his ideas can reveal about the way we live today. The question is simple. Do we have to suffer in order to live? Is that really true? When Schopenhauer says that life is deeply connected to suffering, he is not simply saying that difficult moments exist. His claim is much more radical. Suffering is not an accident that happens from time to time, but something built into the very structure of existence. In The World as Will and Representation, the philosopher tries to show that living means constantly being driven by needs, desires, urges, and feelings of lack. And every need, as long as it remains unsatisfied, is experienced as something missing. That is exactly where suffering begins. Think about something simple. We feel hunger because something is missing. We feel thirst because the body demands something it does not yet have. We miss someone because that person or something important is not present. We feel anxious because we want to control a future that has not happened yet. In all of these cases, there is a distance between who we are now and what we would like to reach. For Schopenhauer, a large part of human life takes place inside that distance. That is why suffering does not appear only in great tragedies. It also shows up in the small worries of everyday life, concerns about money, the fear of losing someone, the need for recognition, frustration at work, insecurity about our appearance, or the feeling that we are falling behind. Some kinds of pain are intense, others are almost silent, but they all reveal the same thing. Human beings rarely remain completely at peace. This idea comes from what Schopenhauer calls the will, and here it is important not to confuse the will with a simple conscious decision. For him, the will is a much deeper, irrational, and endless force that appears in all living beings as the drive to keep existing, desiring, competing, reproducing, and seeking satisfaction. We do not simply choose to want things. Many times, we realize that we already want something before we even understand why. Look at how this works in human life. A person wants financial stability. While they do not have it, they suffer from insecurity. After achieving it, they may begin to want status. Once they gain status, they may start fearing that they will lose it. What once seemed like the final solution quickly becomes a new source of worry. Life, then, never reaches a permanent state of rest. Schopenhauer describes this process clearly by explaining that every desire comes from a need, and every need comes from a sense of lack. As long as we want something we do not yet have, we experience tension. When we finally get what we wanted, we feel relief, but that relief rarely lasts. Soon another need, another fear, or another goal appears. Life keeps moving because the will never says that it has had enough. This helps explain why someone can achieve many of the things they once dreamed about and still remain dissatisfied. The problem is not necessarily what that person achieved. The problem is the expectation that any achievement can create permanent satisfaction. For Schopenhauer, that expectation is destined to fail because no single accomplishment can permanently silence the human tendency to keep wanting more. This is why his philosophy is often called pessimistic. But Schopenhauer's pessimism should not be confused with the simple attitude of someone who believes that everything will go wrong. His argument is philosophical. Even when things go well, we remain vulnerable to pain. We can lose what we have achieved. We can get sick. We can grow old. We can be abandoned. We can experience the death of people we love. And even when none of these tragedies happen, we still deal with inner worries that do not simply disappear because our external circumstances are good. There is an important difference here between Schopenhauer and certain modern promises of happiness. We often hear that if we find the right career, the perfect relationship, or the right mindset, we will finally achieve a completely satisfying life. Schopenhauer would strongly doubt that promise. Not because career, love, or stability are useless, but because none of them can remove our basic vulnerability. This idea may sound dark, but it can also be freeing. If suffering is part of the human condition, then perhaps it is unreasonable to treat every painful experience as proof that we are living the wrong way. Some suffering is caused by bad choices and can certainly be avoided. But other forms of suffering appear simply because we love, desire, grow older, and live as limited human beings. In some ways, Schopenhauer comes close to traditions that existed long before him. Buddhism, which strongly fascinated the philosopher, also begins by recognizing the presence of suffering and dissatisfaction in human existence. This does not mean that Schopenhauer simply copied Eastern thought, but it helps explain why he found in those traditions a confirmation of some of his own philosophical ideas. He can also be compared to ancient thinkers such as the Stoics, although there are important differences. Epictetus, for example, taught that part of our suffering comes from trying to control things that are outside our control. Schopenhauer goes further. Even the things that seem to be under our control are still influenced by the endless movement of desire. The Stoic tries to change the way he judges things in order to achieve greater peace of mind. Schopenhauer tries to understand the deeper root of desire itself. But recognizing that life contains suffering does not mean glorifying pain. Schopenhauer is not telling us to seek hardship on purpose, nor is he saying that every human experience is miserable. There are moments of joy, affection, beauty, and even periods of peace. His point is that none of them can create a permanent form of happiness that is completely protected from change. Perhaps that is why his philosophy can be so uncomfortable. It touches on a deeply human hope, the hope that after our next achievement, we will finally feel complete. Schopenhauer forces us to question that promise. How many times have you believed that you would finally be happy once you achieved a certain goal? And how many times after achieving it did you realize that your mind simply found something new to want? That is where the real power of the statement, "Life is suffering," can be found. It does not require us to believe that every second of life is painful. It asks us to recognize that life cannot be separated from vulnerability, lack, loss, and desire. As long as we are beings who want things, there will always be something we do not yet have. As long as we love, there will always be the possibility of loss. As long as we are alive, we will remain exposed to chance, illness, aging, and death. Schopenhauer therefore forces us to face a reality that we often try to hide behind distractions and promises of permanent happiness. Suffering is not simply a problem that will disappear once we finally get our lives in order. In many cases, it comes from the very fact that we are alive and want to keep living. Understanding this does not immediately remove the pain, but it can deeply change the way we understand it. For Schopenhauer, desire is not just a force that moves us toward our goals. It is also a constant source of restlessness. Whenever we desire something, we are indirectly admitting that we lack it, and that lack creates tension. That is why, in his philosophy, desire and suffering are deeply connected. Desire is born from the feeling that what we have right now is still not enough. This idea appears strongly in the world as will and representation. Schopenhauer argues that every desire comes from a sense of lack. We want because we do not have. We search because we have not yet reached. We keep trying because there is a distance between reality and what we imagine would be better. As long as that distance remains, there is discomfort. Sometimes that discomfort is mild. In other situations, it becomes anxiety, frustration, obsession, or distress. It is easy to see this when we think about intense desires. A person may desperately want to pass an important exam, get a certain job, or have their feelings returned in a relationship. Before getting what they want, their mind keeps returning to the same thing over and over again. They imagine possibilities, fear failure, compare themselves with others, and place their hope in the future, believing that they will finally feel better once they get what they want. Desire stops being just a preference and begins to take over the center of their experience. At this point, Schopenhauer makes an uncomfortable observation. We are not as free when it comes to our desires as we like to believe. We can choose certain paths, but we do not simply choose what attracts us, what we fear, or what we feel we need to have. Many times, we are driven by impulses that appear before any conscious thought. We want recognition before deciding whether recognition really matters. We want approval even when we know rationally that we should not depend on it. This is where the concept of the will comes in again. For Schopenhauer, behind our individual desires there is a more basic force, a never-ending drive that tries to express itself through us. Today it may appear as a desire for money, tomorrow as a desire for power, later as a desire for love, security, pleasure, or admiration. The objects change, but the structure remains the same. We keep wanting because the will itself has no final goal that can bring it to an end. This explains why certain desires seem to promise much more than they can actually give us. When we strongly want something, our imagination often gives it almost unlimited power. We think, once this happens, everything will get better. The mind turns one specific event into a promise that our entire life will change. But after we achieve it, we discover that we are still the same person, with fears, needs, and new expectations. Imagine someone who deeply wants to buy their dream home. For years, they save money, do research, work harder, and make sacrifices. The house begins to represent peace, success, and fulfillment. When they finally buy it, the happiness is real. But after some time, new concerns appear. Maintenance, mortgage payments, security, renovations, and comparisons with better homes. What once seemed like the end of all worry becomes part of a new set of needs. Schopenhauer is not saying that this person should not have bought the house. His point is different. The mistake is expecting that satisfying one desire will bring the entire process of desiring to an end. No object has that kind of power, because the source of desire is not only the thing we want. It also comes from the person who is doing the wanting. This distinction is essential. We often think we suffer because we have not yet achieved something. Schopenhauer would invite us to ask whether part of the suffering also comes from the way our minds become attached to wanting. The more we believe that a certain thing is absolutely necessary for our happiness, the more power we give it over our emotional lives. This becomes even clearer when we look at social comparison. A person may be fairly satisfied with what they have until they discover that someone close to them has achieved something considered better. Suddenly, a new desire appears. The car that once seemed good enough no longer feels good enough. The career that once seemed respectable starts to feel small. Desire can come not from a real need, but simply from seeing that someone else has something we do not have. Because of this, the suffering caused by desire is not limited to poverty or material deprivation. It can also exist in the middle of abundance. A person can have a lot and still suffer because they want even more. They can receive admiration and suffer because they want everyone's admiration. They can be successful and suffer because they found someone who is even more successful. This is one reason Schopenhauer's philosophy remains so provocative in a society built around constantly creating new desires. Advertising, social media, and consumer culture often work by making us feel that we are not enough. Your appearance could be better. Your house could be bigger. Your vacation could be more exclusive. Your life could be more exciting. The more we believe these messages, the easier it becomes to turn simple preferences into things we feel we absolutely need. And there is an irony in this. Desire promises freedom, but it can create dependence. A person believes they are chasing what they want, when they may actually be controlled by the need to keep wanting something. Every new goal seems freely chosen, but the cycle remains similar. Lack, pursuit, expectation, achievement, and then another desire. That is why Schopenhauer invites us to observe our desires before automatically obeying them. Not every desire has to be eliminated, but we can understand its nature. Asking, "Do I really need this?" already changes our relationship with what we want. Asking, "What do I imagine this achievement will do for me?" can reveal expectations that often remain hidden. There is also a difference between real needs and desires that can grow without limit. We need food, shelter, care, and some level of security. But many human desires have no natural stopping point. How much recognition is enough? How much money is enough? How many achievements does a person need before finally seeing themselves as successful? When there is no clear limit, satisfaction can always be pushed into the next stage. This reflection does not require us to give up our ambitions or live without goals. What Schopenhauer questions is the belief that we should find complete fulfillment through them. We can pursue a goal without turning it into the absolute condition for our peace of mind. We can want something without allowing our entire identity to depend on getting it. This change in perspective is important because it reduces the control that desire has over us. When we realize that what we want does not have the power to complete our existence, the intensity of our expectations may begin to decrease. The desire is still there, but it no longer works like a promise of personal salvation. The main question then is not simply how many things we are able to get, but how much power we give to the act of wanting. If every desire comes with the belief that I can only be okay once this happens, then our peace will always depend on something that does not exist yet. The future becomes the place where we expect to truly live, while the present is treated only as an obstacle we have to get through. It is exactly in this process that Schopenhauer identifies one of the most persistent forms of human suffering. We do not suffer only when we lose something. We also suffer while we wait, while we desire, while we imagine, and while we turn a future possibility into a requirement for being at peace right now. Desire seems to point toward what might satisfy us, but very often, more than anything else, it reveals what we believe is still missing from our lives. There are moments when everything finally seems to fall into place. Good news arrives, a problem comes to an end, we achieve something important, someone we love is nearby, and for a little while we feel a kind of inner peace. The world feels less heavy. The mind slows down. Life feels like enough. But this state rarely lasts. For Schopenhauer, the unstable nature of happiness is not just an accidental flaw in human experience. It reveals something essential about the way we live. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer describes satisfaction as temporary because it comes from the disappearance of a need. When we get what we wanted, we feel relief. The tension decreases, the discomfort becomes weaker, and for a while we may call this state happiness. The problem is that this satisfaction has no real stability of its own. It depends on the temporary absence of a need. This completely changes the way we understand happiness. Instead of seeing it as a positive, solid, and permanent state, Schopenhauer often sees it as a temporary break from suffering. We feel pleasure when a need stops putting pressure on us. We feel relief when a worry disappears. We feel satisfied when something finally happens the way we hoped it would. But after some time, our minds adjust. This adjustment is important. Something that once seemed extraordinary can quickly become ordinary. A person gets the job they worked toward for years. During the first few days, they feel proud, excited, and grateful. A few weeks later, the environment already feels familiar. Months later, new pressures, new comparisons, and new goals appear. The achievement is still there, but the emotional effect it once had begins to fade. Schopenhauer understands that human beings have great difficulty staying satisfied with what they already have. Our attention tends to move toward what is missing. While something is far away, it seems valuable. After we achieve it, some of its shine disappears. Not because it has necessarily lost its real value, but because it no longer occupies the place of expectation. This explains why we are often more strongly driven by the promise of happiness than by happiness we have already achieved. The future has a powerful attraction. We imagine what life will be like when a certain situation changes. When we make more money, when we meet someone, when we have more free time, when we gain recognition, when a certain problem finally ends. Our expectations grow because we can fill the future with everything we want. Reality, however, never perfectly matches our imagination. Every real achievement comes with real limitations. The relationship we wanted also brings conflict. Professional success also brings responsibility. Financial freedom can also bring new fears. Moving to a new city can also bring loneliness. The happiness promised by our imagination arrives mixed with the complexity of real life. That is why Schopenhauer is so skeptical of the idea of permanent happiness. He does not deny that we can have pleasant experiences. What he questions is whether those moments can become a continuous condition. Everything that brings us joy is affected by time, change, and loss. A trip ends. A celebration comes to an end. Youth passes. Relationships change. The body changes. Important people can leave our lives. Even a pleasant emotion loses intensity if it lasts too long. What excites us today may feel normal tomorrow. What once seemed like enough may begin to feel like too little. There is a deep psychological observation behind this idea. Many times, we only understand the value of something after we lose it. When we are healthy, we rarely wake up celebrating the simple fact that we are not in pain. But when we get sick, health suddenly seems incredibly valuable. Once we recover, that gratitude often begins to fade again. Schopenhauer notices this imbalance between pleasure and suffering. Pain demands our attention immediately. A toothache can take over an entire night, even if everything else in our life is going relatively well. But the absence of pain rarely creates the same level of happiness. Once the suffering is gone, we quickly return to our normal state. This makes happiness especially fragile. It is not enough for many things to be going well. One serious worry can be enough to take over our entire awareness. A compliment may make us happy for a few hours, while a criticism may stay in our minds for days. An achievement may be celebrated quickly, while the fear of losing it can stay with someone for a long time. That is why Schopenhauer's philosophy challenges the idea that happiness should be our normal state. When we believe it should be, every moment of sadness can feel like a personal failure. We begin to think that something is wrong with us whenever we are not happy. But perhaps the expectation of constant happiness itself makes our frustration even worse. Ancient philosophers had already noticed part of this problem, although they approached it differently. The Stoics, for example, were suspicious of a life in which our emotional well-being depended completely on fortune. Seneca warned about the fragile nature of anything that depends on external circumstances. If our peace depends entirely on possessions, status, or events that can disappear, we will always remain vulnerable. Schopenhauer, however, goes even further. For him, it is not only the instability of the outside world that threatens happiness. Our own inner nature prevents complete and permanent satisfaction. Even if we could protect everything we value, we would still be subject to new needs and desires. This view may sound discouraging if we understand it as a rejection of joy, but it does not have to be understood that way. Knowing that a happy moment will not last forever does not make it false. A song does not lose its value because it ends. Spending time with someone does not become meaningless because it lasts only a few hours. A peaceful period in life does not stop being valuable simply because one day it will change. Maybe the real problem is expecting something temporary by nature to last forever. When we try to turn a good moment into something that should never end, we begin to fear losing it before it is even gone. Instead of simply enjoying the happiness, we start watching over it. We want to make sure it continues. We want to stop things from changing. And this effort to hold on forever to something unstable can create a new kind of suffering. Imagine someone who finally finds a relationship where they feel loved. The happiness is real. But if that person starts believing that their life will only have value as long as the relationship stays exactly the same, that happiness may become mixed with fear. Any change will feel like a threat. Any distance will feel like a sign of loss. In this way, even trying too hard to hold on to happiness can destroy it. Schopenhauer invites us to let go of the fantasy of a life that is permanently satisfying. This does not mean giving up on living well. It means recognizing that joy, pleasure, and peace have their own rhythms and cannot be frozen in place. Maybe a more realistic relationship with happiness begins when we stop asking how to make it last forever. Instead, we can learn to recognize it when it appears, without demanding that it fulfill an impossible promise. Because one of the greatest sources of frustration is not only losing what once made us happy, it is believing that some experience should have been able to keep us happy forever. Schopenhauer breaks down that expectation by showing us that human happiness, whenever it appears, exists within time, and everything that exists within time is always subject to change. There is something curious about pleasure. It almost always appears after some kind of tension. We drink because we are thirsty. We rest because we are tired. We eat because we are hungry. We look for company because loneliness starts to weigh on us. For Schopenhauer, this pattern is not accidental. It shows that much of what we call pleasure appears when some form of discomfort is temporarily interrupted. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer develops the idea that satisfaction has a mainly negative nature. This does not mean negative in a moral sense, as if pleasure were something bad. It means that pleasure appears as the removal of something that was missing before. First, there is a need. Then comes the search. And when that need is satisfied, we feel relief. What we call pleasure is often exactly that relief. This becomes clearer when we look at very simple experiences. A person spends hours feeling thirsty and finally finds water. The first sip can feel incredibly good. But keep drinking after the thirst is gone, and the experience changes completely. The water is the same. What changed was the need. The pleasure was not only in the object itself, but in the relationship between that object and a need that had to be satisfied. The same thing happens with rest. After a physically exhausting day, sitting quietly can feel like a luxury. The whole body receives that break almost like a reward. But sitting for hours when you are no longer tired can create restlessness. What once brought pleasure starts to lose its effect because the condition that made it desirable has disappeared. It is in this movement that Schopenhauer sees an important feature of human experience. We tend to imagine pleasure as something positive that we add to life. More comfort, more fun, more achievements, more pleasant experiences. But he invites us to look back and ask, what discomfort was being removed when this pleasure appeared? That question can deeply change the way we see things. Think about the relief we feel after solving a problem that had been bothering us for weeks. During that time, the worry constantly occupied our minds. When we finally find a solution, we feel a powerful sense of freedom. We breathe easier, sleep better, and may even think, "Now I'm happy." But after a few days, that relief starts to feel normal. Our mind stops celebrating it. For Schopenhauer, this happens because the absence of pain cannot hold our attention forever. We feel pain intensely while it is present, but once it disappears, we quickly get used to its absence. Someone suffering from severe back pain may think almost entirely about getting rid of it. After recovering, they may celebrate for a while. Soon, however, they return to their normal routine without constantly noticing how fortunate they are not to feel that pain anymore. This explains an important imbalance between suffering and pleasure. Pain demands our attention. We do not have to make an effort to notice it. Well-being, on the other hand, often goes unnoticed once it becomes normal. A small rock inside your shoe can control your attention during an entire walk. When you remove it, you feel great relief, but a few minutes later, you probably are not thinking about it anymore. Schopenhauer uses this difference to question a very common hope, the idea that we could collect enough pleasures to build a permanently happy life. The problem is that pleasures do not build up emotionally like money in a bank account. Yesterday's pleasure does not necessarily remove today's restlessness. Every new need requires a new form of satisfaction. Imagine someone who spends months looking forward to a vacation. Work has become exhausting, responsibilities feel overwhelming, and the person starts thinking every day about the moment when they will finally be able to rest. When the vacation arrives, there is a powerful feeling of freedom. Not having to wake up early, deal with pressure, or answer work messages feels wonderful. But notice what can happen after a few days. What first seemed amazing begins to feel normal. The person gets used to resting. If the period of inactivity continues for too long, a new kind of restlessness may appear. They begin looking for activities, places to go, entertainment, something that can fill the time. This does not make the pleasure of the vacation meaningless. It simply shows that part of that pleasure came from the interruption of an earlier state of tension. There is an important philosophical consequence here. If pleasure often depends on removing a need or discomfort, then we cannot understand it by itself. It is connected to the suffering that came before it. Satisfaction feels intense because there was dissatisfaction first. The stronger the need, the greater the relief may seem. This view makes Schopenhauer very different from philosophies that place maximizing pleasure at the center of a good life. He does not believe that simply chasing more pleasant experiences will solve the basic problem of existence. In fact, the constant search for pleasure can keep the cycle of dissatisfaction going. The more we believe that we need something pleasurable in order to feel okay, the more unbearable the ordinary moments of life may seem. Silence begins to feel empty. Routine feels unbearable. A day without anything new feels wasted. Then we start needing more and more stimulation. We can see this especially clearly in our relationship with entertainment and distraction. A person feels uncomfortable or restless and immediately looks for something to fill that feeling. Videos, games, shopping, food, social media, conversations. The stimulation provides a temporary break from the restlessness. But when it ends, the discomfort may return. In this sense, pleasure can work like a temporary painkiller without actually solving what caused the restlessness in the first place. This does not mean that Schopenhauer condemns all pleasure, or that we should distrust every pleasant experience. That would be a distorted version of his philosophy. He is interested in showing the limits of pleasure, not pretending that pleasure does not exist. There are real pleasures, and some of them can have great value. The problem begins when we give them a power they do not have, the power to permanently remove dissatisfaction. This difference is important. We can enjoy a good meal without expecting it to transform our entire existence. We can enjoy a trip without demanding that the feelings stay with us after we come home. We can celebrate an achievement without imagining that we will never have problems again. When pleasure no longer carries the responsibility of saving us, maybe we can experience it in a clearer and healthier way. There is another part of Schopenhauer's thinking worth considering. Something that brings pleasure can produce the opposite effect when we have too much of it. Delicious food can become unpleasant once we are full. A fun party can turn into exhaustion. Too much rest can lead to boredom and lack of energy. Once again, this shows that pleasure is not simply contained inside things. It depends on a certain need, a certain moment, and a certain limit. The ancient Epicureans had already noticed something similar, although they reached different conclusions. Epicurus valued simple pleasures and believed that many forms of happiness came from the absence of disturbance and pain. Schopenhauer is more pessimistic about life as a whole, but both challenge the idea that living well means constantly searching for stronger and stronger stimulation. The difference is that, for Schopenhauer, behind our need for satisfaction is the will, that endless force that keeps creating new demands. Satisfying one need does not destroy the will. It only quiets one expression of it for a while. It is like putting out one flame while others begin to appear. That is why every pleasure carries a limitation that we often prefer to ignore. It ends. Once we understand this, the question changes from, how can I feel pleasure all the time? To why do I need pleasure to be present all the time? This shift is philosophical because it directs our attention away from the thing we desire and toward our dependence on it. Maybe that is exactly where Schopenhauer wants to take us. The problem is not enjoying relief when it comes. The problem is imagining that a long enough series of pleasant moments could permanently remove every form of tension from life. As long as there are needs, there will be discomfort. As long as something is missing, there will be searching. Pleasure appears between these moments as a valuable but limited break. It reduces tension, temporarily closes a wound, and interrupts restlessness. But it does not stop the process that creates new needs. And that is why, in Schopenhauer's view, what we so often call happiness may be less like something we permanently possess, and more like that brief moment when something finally stops hurting. There is a kind of restlessness that follows almost every human achievement. As soon as we reach something important, we start looking at what is still missing. Schopenhauer sees this not just as a personality trait, but as a basic feature of existence. For him, satisfaction rarely ends with itself. Instead, it makes room for new demands, new fears, and new goals. In the world as will and representation, this pattern is connected to the endless movement of the will. Human beings do not desire just one specific thing. We are constantly driven by different impulses. That is why the feeling of being complete tends to slip away. One desire is satisfied, but our ability to desire remains untouched. We can see this in the way we deal with personal goals. Someone believes they will finally feel completely satisfied once they reach a certain level in their career. They get the promotion, feel proud, maybe celebrate for a few days, but soon they begin to notice another position, another salary, or another kind of recognition they could achieve. The finish line moves. The problem is not necessarily wanting to grow. The philosophical question is whether we expect there to be a final point where the mind says, "That's enough. I don't need anything else." For Schopenhauer, that final moment rarely happens because the will is not made to stay at rest forever. This same pattern also appears in more personal situations. A person may want the approval of someone specific. Once they get it, they begin to want that approval to continue. Later, they may want approval from even more people. The object changes, but the dependence remains. So dissatisfaction does not come only from what we do not have. It can also come from what we have already achieved. The more we value something, the more we may fear losing it. In this way, something that was supposed to give us security can instead create constant worry. A person may become financially stable, for example, but instead of feeling only peace of mind, They start worrying about investments, savings, inflation, future security, and the possibility of losing what they have. The original need becomes weaker, but new concerns appear because of the achievement itself. This paradox is central to Schopenhauer's thinking. Success does not necessarily remove restlessness. Sometimes it simply changes its form. That is why he does not believe satisfaction depends simply on having more. A person may have very little and desire a lot, but someone can also have a great deal and still feel incomplete. The amount of things we own does not directly determine the amount of peace we feel. There is an important criticism here of the idea that happiness is a matter of accumulation. If the problem existed only in external things, then all we would have to do is get what we do not have. But for Schopenhauer, there is also an inner source of dissatisfaction, the very structure of wanting itself. Imagine someone who starts running to improve their health. At first, completing 5 kilometers feels like a major victory. After some time, that same distance no longer feels like enough. Then the goal becomes 10 kilometers. Later, maybe a half marathon. After that come faster times, new records, and new comparisons. None of this is necessarily bad. The example simply shows how quickly we turn achievements into new starting points. It is almost as if the mind has trouble keeping the value of what it has already achieved alive. What seemed extraordinary yesterday becomes normal today. And once the extraordinary becomes normal, we begin searching for something else that can give us that feeling of progress again. Schopenhauer also points out that this dissatisfaction is not limited to material desires. We may desire knowledge, influence, beauty, youth, status, love, or importance. Even goals that seem noble can follow the same pattern when we expect them to give us a complete sense of fulfillment. A scholar may publish a book and immediately want greater recognition. An artist may receive applause and still feel ignored. A person who is loved may receive affection and still wonder whether they are loved enough. The uncomfortable point is this: we often do not know how to define what enough actually means. How much success is enough? How much recognition is enough? How many people need to admire you? How much money would it take to permanently remove every feeling of insecurity? When we cannot answer these questions, we risk turning life into a race where the finish line keeps moving every time we get close to it. Schopenhauer sees this as a direct expression of the will. It does not operate according to a rational plan that leads to final fulfillment. It pushes, pressures, and constantly creates new needs. There is no clearly defined final goal that, once reached, brings all movement to an end. This also helps explain why comparison is so powerful. We may feel satisfied until we look at someone who seems to have more. Suddenly, something that never bothered us before begins to feel like a problem. A comfortable apartment feels small after visiting a luxury home. A decent salary feels inadequate after finding out how much a coworker earns. An ordinary life starts to feel like a failure when compared with carefully selected versions of other people's lives. In this case, dissatisfaction is created by a change in what we use as a reference point. Social media makes this especially clear. It allows a person to compare their everyday reality with the best moments of hundreds of other people. The result can be a constant feeling of not being enough. Someone is traveling more, earning more, working out more, celebrating more, or appearing happier. Schopenhauer lived long before social media, but his philosophy gives us a powerful way to understand this problem. The will always finds new things to chase. The more things we are exposed to, the more things we may begin to see as missing from our own lives. Still, it would be too simple to conclude that we should give up every desire to improve. The question is not whether we should choose between endless ambition and complete passivity. The challenge is noticing when a goal stops being something we want and becomes something we believe we must achieve in order to feel worthy or fulfilled. There is a huge difference between thinking, I would like to achieve this, and thinking, I can only feel complete once I achieve this. The first statement contains desire. The second contains a deeper kind of dependence. And maybe that dependence is exactly what makes dissatisfaction so painful. When we always place our sense of value in the next stage of life, the present is never allowed to be enough. It becomes nothing more than a hallway we have to walk through before reaching some ideal future. This way of thinking can continue for decades. First, we wait to finish school. Then we wait to get a job. Then to move forward in our career. Then to buy something important. Then to become financially stable. Then to have more free time. And while one stage replaces another, there is a risk that we realize too late that we turned our entire life into preparation for something else. Schopenhauer offers an uncomfortable thought. Maybe there is no future moment when every piece will finally fall into place and stay that way forever. That does not have to lead to despair. It can lead to a clearer way of seeing life. Recognizing that complete satisfaction is difficult to achieve can help us lower unrealistic expectations. It can also help us pay more attention to what is already present, without demanding that every part of life be improved before we allow ourselves to value it. In this sense, philosophy can help correct the way we look at things. Instead of constantly asking, what is still missing? We can ask why what we already have lost its value so quickly in our minds. That question is uncomfortable because it moves the problem away from the outside world and toward our relationship with the world. Maybe we have learned to recognize progress only through having more money, more experiences, more followers, more achievements. But a life built only around more will have a hard time finding a place to rest. Schopenhauer forces us to recognize that human dissatisfaction will not be solved simply by giving desire more things to chase. If part of our restlessness comes from the tendency to want endlessly, then constantly trying to fill that space may actually make it even bigger. The real problem is no longer the absence of one specific achievement. It becomes the inability to see any achievement as enough, even for a little while. And maybe one of the hardest questions we can ask ourselves is this: if I got everything today that I believe is missing from my life, how long would it take before I started wanting something else? For Schopenhauer, understanding existence requires us to let go of the comfortable idea that we are mainly ruled by reason. In the world as will and representation, he argues that beneath our thoughts, choices, and conscious plans, there is a deeper force at work. The will, an endless drive that comes before the rational explanations we use in everyday life. This will does not simply mean deciding that we want money, love, success, or recognition. Schopenhauer uses the term in a much deeper, philosophical sense. It is the force that appears in every drive to exist, survive, reproduce, and assert ourselves. Before we even create goals, we are already beings caught in a constant movement of seeking, preserving, and continuing our existence. That is why reason, although important, does not sit on the throne we usually give it. We often think that we first think, and then decide what we want. Schopenhauer reverses that order. The desire is already there, and the mind often steps in afterward to find ways, explanations, and strategies to satisfy it. A person, for example, may spend their entire life chasing professional status and explain that dedication as responsibility, discipline, or healthy ambition. But behind those reasons, there may actually be a deep need for approval. Intelligence organizes the path, but it does not necessarily choose the force that pushed the person forward in the first place. This idea helps explain a common experience. Knowing what makes sense does not guarantee that we will do what makes sense. Someone knows they need to rest, but keeps working nonstop. Another person understands that a certain argument is pointless, but still feels the need to win. Rational understanding is there, but the impulse keeps demanding satisfaction. Schopenhauer sees the same pattern outside human psychology. To him, all of nature seems filled with forces of survival and conflict. Plants compete for light, animals search for food, and living organisms fight to preserve themselves. Life does not wait for a rational explanation before asserting itself. It simply keeps pushing forward and reproducing. This helps explain why the will is called irrational. It does not calculate whether life will produce enough happiness, and it does not ask whether a certain amount of suffering is worth it. It simply keeps asserting itself. An injured animal fights to survive. A human being may continue wanting things even when those desires are causing pain. This makes Schopenhauer's philosophy especially uncomfortable for anyone who believes they have complete control over themselves. We can control certain behaviors, think about consequences, and change habits, but we do not freely choose every impulse that appears inside us. Many times, we realize that we want something before we even understand why it became so important to us. We can see this in personal relationships. Someone may say that they only want to be loved, but that desire can turn into a need for control. They begin watching, demanding, and fearing any kind of distance. The mind then creates reasons to justify the possessiveness. The feeling may look noble on the surface, while the will is really trying to secure emotional control. Something similar happens with money. The search for security can slowly turn into endless accumulation. A person keeps saying they need more money to finally feel safe, even though every increase in wealth creates new concerns. The will changes the meaning of enough and keeps the feeling of lack alive. This idea also helps explain conflicts that seem completely rational. Two people may argue for hours about principles, but pride, resentment, or fear of losing authority may actually be driving the conversation. Each side builds sophisticated arguments without realizing that the mind may simply be acting like a lawyer defending impulses that were never honestly examined. Schopenhauer does not conclude, however, that thinking is useless. Consciousness can recognize the patterns of desire and create some distance from them. This awareness does not immediately destroy the will, but it can stop us from treating every impulse as a command that must be obeyed. Simply noticing a desire already changes our relationship with it. This is where art becomes important in his philosophy. During an aesthetic experience, we can observe something without immediately asking how it can satisfy our needs. A painting, a landscape, or a poem can temporarily free us from the pressure of personal interest. For a few moments, understanding no longer exists only to serve desire. Compassion offers another kind of break. When another person's suffering matters to us, simply because they are suffering, we stop focusing only on our own interests. The selfish will meet a limit. Instead of asking only what we can gain, we recognize that another vulnerable human being exists in front of us. This possibility shows that being dominated by the will does not mean we are condemned to blindly obey every impulse. Schopenhauer does not offer complete freedom, but he does describe different degrees of liberation. The less automatically we react to our impulses, the more room we create for reflection, compassion, self-control, and choices that are less centered on the ego. There is an important difference here between doing what we want and actually being free. If freedom simply meant satisfying every desire, then a person controlled by their impulses would be considered free whenever they managed to fulfill them. Schopenhauer suggests the opposite. Inner freedom begins when wanting something does not automatically mean that we have to obey that desire. This interpretation also prevents us from seeing Schopenhauer as someone who supports passivity. Recognizing the power of the will does not mean giving up on goals, plans, or decisions. It means examining what is driving us. Ambition can be reasonable, but it becomes dangerous when it takes control of our entire identity. A desire can exist without being given authority over our whole life. So the main challenge here is not simply asking whether we have a will, but realizing how much of our lives is organized by forces we rarely examine. Schopenhauer shifts our attention away from the explanations we give ourselves and toward the impulses underneath them. Understanding this control does not completely remove it, but it can create space for us to live with greater awareness. Schopenhauer noticed something deeply uncomfortable about human experience. When one desire is satisfied, we rarely find lasting peace. What once seemed capable of completing our lives loses its intensity, becomes ordinary, and makes room for another need. The object changes, but the process of wanting remains constantly active within us. In the world as will and representation, this process is connected to the will, the endless force that drives all living beings. It has no final goal that can bring it to an end. We can satisfy specific desires, but we do not eliminate our ability to desire. That is why every satisfaction offers only a temporary break from wanting. Imagine someone who dreams for years about getting a promotion at work. While it has not happened yet, everything seems to depend on that moment. When they finally get it, they feel proud and relieved. Soon, however, a new goal appears. A higher position, a better salary, more recognition. The old dream becomes nothing more than the new starting point. The problem is not necessarily setting new goals. Growing, learning, and building new projects can give direction to life. Schopenhauer questions something else: the hope that one specific achievement can permanently silence our restlessness. When we expect that, we give the things we desire a power they simply do not have over us. This pattern also appears in consumer behavior. Something we want can occupy our minds for weeks. We research it, compare options, and imagine how satisfying it will feel to own it. After we buy it, there is excitement, but the feeling of novelty begins to fade. Before long, another product appears that seems more attractive, more modern, or more desirable, quietly starting the same psychological process again. Desire, then, has an impressive ability to keep changing our definition of what is enough. What seemed extraordinary yesterday may feel normal today. Our standards rise, our expectations adjust, and our minds begin to notice what is missing again. Schopenhauer sees this as an important reason why human beings have such a hard time remaining fully satisfied. This becomes even clearer when comparison enters the picture. A person may feel satisfied with their situation until they notice that someone else has something considered better. Nothing has been taken away from them, but their experience changes. A new desire appears because a new point of comparison turns what once seemed sufficient into something that suddenly feels inadequate. Social media creates the perfect environment for this process. Every day, we are exposed to carefully selected images of success, beauty, travel, wealth, and recognition. Every comparison can suggest something new that we are missing. So even someone who already has a lot may still feel behind, incomplete, or below a standard that is constantly changing in front of them. Schopenhauer lived long before this technological reality, but his analysis still feels surprisingly relevant. The will only needs new things to desire in order to keep operating. The more possibilities we know about, the more things we can want. Abundance, then, does not necessarily eliminate dissatisfaction. In some cases, it increases the number of expectations we carry with us every day. Some desires are connected to survival, while others are connected to identity. We need food and protection, but we also want to be admired, recognized, and important. These social and emotional desires can grow almost without limit. After all, how much recognition is enough? How many people need to admire someone before the need for approval finally disappears completely? The difficulty is that many desires have no natural ending point. We can always earn more, achieve more, improve more, or become more well-known. When there is no inner limit, life can become controlled by an endless series of goals that never bring true rest when they are completed. This pattern can even affect personal growth. Improving our habits and abilities can be healthy, but someone can turn their entire life into an endless project of fixing themselves. They need to be more productive, more disciplined, more interesting, more attractive, and more successful. No current version of themselves is ever allowed to feel good enough. In that situation, the future becomes the imaginary place where real life will finally begin. The person thinks they will rest after the next achievement, enjoy life after the next stage, or feel complete after the next transformation. But every arrival creates another destination, and the present continues to be treated only as preparation. Schopenhauer forces us to examine not only what we want, but also the hidden promise inside that desire. Many times, we do not simply want an object. We want the feeling we imagine we will have after getting it. Security, recognition, peace, or a sense of belonging are projected onto things that may never be able to carry such high expectations. This realization allows us to separate desire from dependence. We can want something without turning it into an absolute requirement for feeling okay. The difference may seem small, but it is deeply important. When we say, "I would like to have this," there is still some inner space. When we think, "I need this to feel complete," we give that object enormous emotional power. For Schopenhauer, living a life that is less controlled by desire does not necessarily mean giving up every goal. It means learning to recognize which desires are reasonable and which ones simply repeat patterns of dissatisfaction, comparison, or vanity. Not every impulse deserves to become a goal. Some desires lose their strength when we finally understand where they really came from. This kind of awareness creates a different kind of freedom from the one promised by unlimited satisfaction. It is not the freedom to get everything we want, but the freedom of not having to chase everything. When we allow a desire to pass without immediately turning it into a need, we briefly interrupt the chain that usually pushes us toward the next pursuit. So the endless nature of desire reveals a trap. We can spend our entire lives chasing something that changes its name every time we get close to it. Schopenhauer invites us to recognize this pattern before every achievement turns into another feeling of not having enough. Limiting our desires can, paradoxically, increase our inner freedom. Schopenhauer describes human existence through a powerful image, a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. When we want something we do not yet have, we feel lack, tension, and restlessness. But when we finally get what we wanted, that relief can give way to emptiness, monotony, and a lack of inner direction. This idea appears in the world as will and representation, and summarizes one of Schopenhauer's best-known insights. Pain appears when the will runs into obstacles. Boredom appears when there is no urgent goal occupying the mind. So satisfying a desire does not guarantee lasting peace, because another form of restlessness can soon take its place. It is important to understand that pain here does not mean only physical suffering. It also includes anxiety, frustration, worry, need, fear, and any experience in which we feel that something has to change before we can feel okay. As long as that need remains unresolved, our attention tends to stay focused on the problem we are trying to overcome. When the need finally disappears, we imagine that we will find complete satisfaction. Schopenhauer, however, notices that the absence of pressure can create another problem: not knowing what to do with our own time. Without an immediate goal, the mind begins searching for stimulation, activities, or even conflicts that can bring movement back into everyday life. Imagine someone who spends months complaining about having too much work. This person dreams about completely free days, with no meetings, deadlines, or responsibilities. When vacation finally comes, the rest feels wonderful. After some time, however, restlessness begins to appear, along with the question, "What do I do now?" Strangely, freedom can begin to feel heavy too. This example shows that boredom is not simply a lack of entertainment. For Schopenhauer, it reveals a deeper difficulty: staying at rest when the will has nothing new to chase. We are used to living around goals, and when those goals disappear, an uncomfortable feeling of inner emptiness can appear. While we are chasing something, we have direction. We may feel tired or frustrated, but we know what we are trying to achieve. The goal organizes our thoughts and behavior. When it ends and another goal does not immediately take its place, we may realize that part of our everyday sense of purpose came from the tension created by the desire itself. That is why Schopenhauer sees boredom as philosophically important. It shows that removing pain does not automatically create positive and lasting satisfaction. Often, we simply remove whatever was occupying our minds. Then the empty space has to be filled, and the will begins looking again for something new to desire intensely. This back and forth movement helps explain behaviors that may seem contradictory. Overworked people dream about silence. When they get too much silence, they look for noise. Someone who wants a peaceful routine may later start missing excitement. We want rest when we feel pressure and stimulation when things become too quiet, moving back and forth without noticing the pattern. Modern life makes this especially easy to see. Almost every empty moment can immediately be filled with screens, messages, videos, or notifications. For many people, waiting even a few minutes without stimulation has become difficult. The smallest feeling of boredom finds an instant solution, preventing us from experiencing silence without quickly turning it into constant activity. Schopenhauer obviously never knew smartphones or social media, but his analysis helps us understand this need for stimulation. Maybe we do not always look for entertainment because we are truly interested in it. Sometimes we look for almost anything simply to avoid the uncomfortable feeling of having nothing urgent to do or chase. This does not mean that boredom is always bad. It can reveal dependencies that were hidden by constant activity. When no task demands our attention, we begin to see how much we depend on always being busy in order to feel that our time has value. In this sense, boredom works like a mirror, showing us how difficult it can be to simply stay present and still. Here we find an important difference between boredom and contemplation. Doing nothing does not necessarily mean feeling empty. A person can walk slowly, look at a landscape, or sit quietly without feeling bored. Boredom appears when the moment seems worthless, simply because it offers no goal for the individual will to pursue. This difference helps explain why art is so important in Schopenhauer's philosophy. During an aesthetic experience, we can pay attention to something without immediately turning it into a tool for personal satisfaction. We are not looking for advantage, ownership, or a result. For a few moments, the mind escapes both the pressure of lack and the emptiness of boredom. Contemplation, then, offers a possibility outside the two extremes of the pendulum. We do not have to suffer because something is missing, and we do not have to create constant stimulation just to escape emptiness. We can experience something without demanding that it solve a need. This pause is temporary, but it shows that another way of paying attention is possible. The pendulum also helps explain why a life built only around excitement tends to become exhausting. The more we depend on intense new experiences, the less we tolerate ordinary ones. Things that once felt satisfying begin to seem boring. The search for stronger stimulation increases, while our ability to rest gradually becomes weaker. Schopenhauer does not recommend creating suffering in order to escape boredom, and he does not praise an empty life. His analysis works as a diagnosis. When we are ruled by wanting, we suffer both when we face resistance and when we have nothing to pursue. Recognizing this pattern matters because it prevents us from confusing constant activity with genuine inner fulfillment. The main question then becomes something different. Can we remain at peace when nothing urgent needs to happen? If the answer is no, maybe the problem is not only in our circumstances, but also in the relationship we have with our own desires. Schopenhauer turns boredom into a sign of a deeper restlessness within us. Schopenhauer does not treat suffering as a simple accident that could disappear if we organized our lives perfectly. For him, some forms of pain belong to the human condition itself. We are vulnerable, limited beings, aware of loss and unable to completely control what happens to us, to our bodies, or to the people we deeply love. This idea appears in the world as will and representation. Human existence is subject to change, chance, aging, and death. Even when we manage to build a sense of security, we are still exposed to events that can completely change our plans. No amount of intelligence can make a human life completely protected from suffering. This means that not every kind of suffering should be understood as the result of a personal mistake. Sometimes we make responsible choices and still experience loss. We can take care of our health and still become sick. We can love someone sincerely and still be left behind. We can work hard and still watch a project fail unexpectedly. This distinction is important because we often add guilt to our pain. When something goes wrong, we immediately ask ourselves where we failed, as if every event could have been controlled. Schopenhauer challenges that expectation. Some forms of suffering come from bad decisions, but others happen simply because being alive means being exposed to uncertainty. The body may be the clearest example. We can strengthen it, eat well, and protect it, but we cannot stop it from aging forever. Growing older reveals a truth that our culture often tries to hide. We do not have complete control over our own bodies. Time changes what we would like to preserve forever. The same is true of our relationships. Loving someone means allowing that person to become important to us. That importance brings joy, but it also brings vulnerability. If nothing could ever be lost, perhaps nothing would truly feel precious. The possibility of suffering comes with what we value, because every human relationship also exists within time. Recognizing this does not mean becoming passive in the face of pain. Schopenhauer does not give us an excuse to accept violence, exploitation, or injustice as unavoidable. Some forms of suffering can be reduced to personal decisions, better institutions, and moral responsibility. Confusing unavoidable suffering with preventable suffering would be a serious philosophical and practical mistake. The human condition, then, involves two different levels. On one level, we can act to improve our circumstances. On another, we face limits that no reform can completely remove. We can fight disease without eliminating mortality. We can build healthier relationships without guaranteeing that there will never be separation. We can seek security without removing every risk. This view has some similarities with Stoicism, although Schopenhauer takes a different path. In his Enchiridion, Epictetus separates the things that are under our control from the things that are not. Peace of mind requires understanding that boundary. Schopenhauer adds that even our inner impulses are partly outside irrational control we imagine we have over ourselves. That is why suffering does not necessarily mean that life is going wrong. This is especially important in a culture that often presents constant happiness as a sign of success. When we believe we should always feel good, every moment of sadness can seem like a personal failure. Unavoidable pain then creates another kind of pain, the constant feeling that something is wrong with us. Schopenhauer breaks down this expectation by showing that no life remains protected from loss. Even people we admire experience fear, illness, rejection, and grief. Money can remove certain practical difficulties, but it cannot buy protection from mortality. Status can provide advantages, but it cannot prevent loneliness, aging, or the death of someone we love. This shared vulnerability also has an ethical consequence. If all of us are capable of suffering, then we share a condition that goes beyond social differences. Another person's suffering does not belong to some completely separate world. It reveals a weakness and vulnerability that under different circumstances could also become part of our own lives. This is where compassion becomes especially important for Schopenhauer. And on the basis of morality, he sees the ability to recognize another person's suffering as the foundation of true moral behavior. When someone else's pain no longer feels distant from us, the ego loses some of its control over our choices. Suffering then can either bring people closer or make them harder. A wounded person may turn their experience into resentment and want others to suffer too. Another person may become more sensitive to the vulnerability of others. Pain by itself does not create wisdom. What matters is how we understand and respond to what happened to us. There is also suffering caused by trying to deny that we suffer. Some people treat every form of sadness as weakness and try to hide it even from themselves. Schopenhauer offers a more realistic alternative. Recognize the pain without turning it into a permanent identity. Accepting that suffering exists does not mean allowing it to take over our entire mind. This attitude changes our relationship with control. Planning is still important, but planning is no longer confused with a guarantee. We take care of things because some outcomes depend on our actions, not because we believe we can control the entire future. Maturity appears when responsibility and awareness of our limits can exist together without creating inner conflict. Some kinds of pain require immediate action. Others require distance, treatment, justice, or change. And there are also forms of pain that simply have to be lived through, because no solution can undo what happened. Grief is a clear example. No one can bring back exactly what was lost. In that situation, living means learning how to carry an absence. Perhaps the most important contribution of this idea is that it removes the expectation that suffering must always have some great explanation. Not every pain contains a hidden message, and not every loss happened to teach us something. Sometimes suffering is simply part of living a fragile and vulnerable human life. There is a strange moment after any major achievement. What once seemed capable of changing everything slowly starts to feel normal. The happiness lasts for a while, but the mind soon finds something else to want. This is exactly where Schopenhauer identifies one of the most persistent patterns in human life. In The World as Will and Representation, he explains that satisfying one desire does not mean defeating desire itself. The specific desire disappears, but the force that created it remains active. It is as if satisfaction simply makes room for another need to appear, with a new object and a new promise. Imagine someone who spent years dreaming of buying their own home. For a long time, that goal represents security, independence, and success. When they finally achieve it, they feel proud and relieved. But after a few months, new concerns begin to appear. Better furniture, remodeling a room, moving to a better neighborhood, or buying an even bigger house. None of this means the earlier achievement was meaningless. The point is that it did not create the permanent emotional stability the person may have expected. The house solved a real need, but it did not remove the ability to desire. The will simply found new ways to express itself within that new reality. This process helps explain why human beings get used so quickly to things that once seemed extraordinary. An achievement changes our circumstances, but it also changes our expectations. What felt like a privilege yesterday can become the minimum standard today. Our expectations rise, and the feeling that something is missing returns at a different level. Satisfaction, then, has a paradoxical effect. It removes one need while also expanding our awareness of other possibilities. The more we know, the more we can want. The more we achieve, the more we notice what still exists beyond that achievement. Having more does not necessarily put an end to desire. Sometimes it simply gives desire new things to chase. We can see this clearly in work and career. A person may begin by wanting only financial stability. After achieving it, they start looking for recognition. Once they receive recognition, they want influence. Later, they may want independence, leadership, or status. Every victory changes what seems important, and the old goal loses some of its emotional power. Schopenhauer does not condemn every form of ambition. It would be too simple to understand his philosophy as a recommendation to do nothing. What he questions is the belief that a growing series of achievements will eventually lead to permanent satisfaction. If the basic structure of wanting keeps working, that final point will always remain out of reach. Consumer culture shows the same process even more clearly. An object can seem extremely desirable when we do not have it. We think about it, research it, compare options, and imagine how good it will feel to finally own it. After we buy it, the excitement begins to fade. The object remains, but the emotional intensity surrounding it starts to disappear. Soon, something new appears. This cycle does not depend only on advertising, although advertising knows how to use it very well. It also depends on the way our attention responds to novelty. New things catch our attention. Familiar things lose their impact. Desire, then, constantly looks for something new that can bring back the excitement that routine no longer provides. There is also a more subtle pattern. Satisfaction can create fear. Before having something, we are afraid we will never get it. After getting it, we may become afraid of losing it. An achievement that promised peace can create a new kind of worry, because what we now value requires protection, maintenance, and continuity. Think about someone who finally becomes widely recognized. For years, that person wanted to be seen, admired, and appreciated. Once it happens, another concern appears: staying relevant. Every new project is compared with the previous one. Every drop in attention feels like a threat. Recognition is no longer only a source of pleasure. It also becomes a responsibility. So satisfaction can create two movements at the same time: wanting more and protecting what we already have. In both cases, the will remains active. It does not only point toward what is missing. It also holds tightly to what already exists and tries to prevent any possibility of loss. This helps explain why so many people live in a constant state of preparation. They finish one goal and immediately create another. They complete one project and are already worried about the next one. They celebrate only briefly because the mind quickly turns the achievement into another step. Life, then, can become a staircase with no top floor. There is always another stage, another number, another position, another version of ourselves that seems more complete. The problem is not moving forward. The problem is never allowing ourselves to fully experience an achievement before turning it into another reason to feel dissatisfied. At this point, Schopenhauer offers a criticism that still feels extremely relevant today. We are often encouraged to believe that stopping means failing. We are expected to grow, produce, accumulate, improve, and constantly push ourselves further. But we rarely stop to ask what amount would actually be enough. How much money would be enough? How much recognition would be enough? How many achievements would it take? If there is no answer, maybe we are not chasing a specific goal at all. Maybe we are simply obeying the logic of more. That word captures a great deal of what Schopenhauer means by the will. Wanting does not necessarily have a natural limit. It can always increase its demands. Someone who wants 10 may want 20 afterward. Someone who reaches 100 may make 1,000 the new standard. Satisfaction does not end the scale. It often just changes its limits. That is why learning to recognize what is enough has enormous philosophical importance. It does not mean giving up growth or accepting any situation without question. It means creating limits that the will does not naturally create on its own. Without those limits, every achievement can become the starting point for another dissatisfaction. It is possible to want something, and once we achieve it, allow it to have value without immediately asking what comes next. That pause requires awareness, because it goes against the automatic habit of always wanting more. It also requires gratitude, not in the shallow sense of repeating positive phrases, but in the sense of truly noticing what has already become part of our lives and remembering that it once seemed far away. We often quickly forget the things we once wanted deeply. Schopenhauer forces us to notice this kind of forgetfulness. What was once a dream can become ordinary background scenery. If we fail to recognize this, we will spend our lives constantly looking ahead, while almost everything we have achieved slowly loses its emotional value behind us. The goal, then, is not to eliminate every new desire, but to stop every moment of satisfaction from being immediately consumed by the next one. When we learn to recognize this pattern, we begin to understand the difference between progress and compulsion. The idea of complete happiness often appears as a promise. Once everything is finally taken care of, we will be able to live in peace. Schopenhauer questions exactly this expectation and explains why it always remains out of reach. In the world as will and representation, absolute happiness runs into a basic problem. We are beings who constantly desire, and every desire comes from something we feel is missing and still needs to be satisfied. If every satisfied desire were truly final, maybe we could reach a permanent state of fulfillment. But experience shows something different. One achievement solves a problem and quickly creates room for something new. That new space is exactly where the will takes over again. What once seemed like enough becomes ordinary, and what we still do not have begins to gain emotional importance once again. That is why Schopenhauer does not define happiness as something stable that we can permanently possess. What we call happiness usually depends on the temporary end of a need, worry, pain, or inner tension that was already there. When that tension disappears, we feel relief. But the relief becomes weaker once it turns into routine. The mind quickly gets used to well-being and stops seeing it as something extraordinary or special. A person may spend years dreaming about financial stability. When they finally achieve it, they experience real security. But soon other concerns appear: protecting their savings, maintaining their income, avoiding losses, and planning for the future. The happiness promised by that achievement was not false. It was limited. The mistake was expecting one favorable situation to permanently remove every possibility of restlessness from human life. There is also another obstacle. Everything we value is still subject to change. Health can disappear, relationships can end, positions can be lost, and carefully made plans can unexpectedly fall apart. This makes every form of human happiness vulnerable. Even when we are going through a wonderful period in life, we know, even if only quietly, that nothing guarantees it will last. Time itself makes everything we experience fragile. Schopenhauer does not need to deny moments of joy in order to make this argument. We can love, celebrate, create, rest, and experience beauty. What he rejects is the idea that these moments can be turned into something permanently guaranteed. The demand for permanence creates a painful paradox. The more we need a happy situation to remain exactly the same, the more we begin to fear any change that could threaten what we have achieved. In this way, the fear of losing something can enter the experience of pleasure itself. A person has something valuable, but can no longer fully enjoy it because their attention is constantly watching for possible threats. The search for complete happiness can then create even more unhappiness. If we believe we should always feel satisfied, every moment of sadness begins to look like failure, as if feeling pain means we are living the wrong way. This expectation also appears easily through social comparison. We see happy pieces of other people's lives and imagine that they have reached a constant state of fulfillment, while our own lives still feel complicated and imperfect. Schopenhauer breaks down this illusion by reminding us that no human life is free from limitation and mortality. The appearance of success does not reveal private fears, future losses, inner conflicts, or desires that are still unsatisfied. There is also an important difference between complete happiness and a good life. Rejecting the first does not mean that friendship, health, comfort, knowledge, art, or relationships built with care are worthless. These things can greatly improve our lives. Schopenhauer's argument is simply that none of them can make a person completely protected from suffering or stop new needs from appearing over time. This distinction prevents us from understanding Schopenhauer's pessimism as simple rejection of joy. He does not say that everything is equally bad. He says that no good thing can guarantee permanent and absolute satisfaction. Aristotle offers an interesting contrast. In the Nicomachean Ethics, happiness is not simply constant pleasure, but a human life lived through virtuous activity. Schopenhauer, however, remains much more pessimistic on a deeper philosophical level. For him, even a well-ordered and virtuous life cannot remove the root of desire. We can live better, act morally, and reduce unnecessary suffering, but we still remain part of an existence shaped by a basic sense of lack. That is why his philosophy changes the traditional question. Instead of asking how to achieve total happiness, it asks how we can become less dependent on desire and reduce the suffering it creates. This change may seem small, but it completely changes the direction of the discussion. If perfect happiness is impossible, maybe we do not need to organize our entire lives around a desperate race toward a final state that does not exist. We can begin to value real improvements without expecting them to save us. A relationship can be precious without solving every problem. A career can matter without completely defining our personal worth. This attitude also changes the way we experience pleasant moments. Instead of demanding that they last, we can recognize them while they are happening. The fact that they are temporary does not make them false. It simply means they are not absolute. A song ends and can still have value. A friendship can change and still remain meaningful. A peaceful period can come to an end without erasing what it gave us while it lasted. The difficulty begins when we turn something temporary into a permanent condition for our peace. At that moment, the desire to preserve what we love begins to create anxiety even before any loss actually happens. Schopenhauer does not offer a comfortable formula for escaping this vulnerability. His answer involves reducing the power of the will, developing contemplation, compassion, and detachment, instead of endlessly multiplying our personal demands. The fewer absolute conditions we place on reality, the fewer ways reality can seem unbearable when it changes. This does not eliminate pain, but it reduces the frustration created by impossible expectations. Perhaps real clarity begins when we give up the demand to be completely happy and learn to recognize limited, good things without expecting perfection from them. In that sense, accepting limits can make life less controlled by illusion. Look at nature for a moment without romanticizing it. There is growth, beauty, and cooperation, but there is also competition, hunger, destruction, and death. Schopenhauer starts from this contrast to develop a radical idea. Behind the apparent order of the world, there is not a kind and reasonable force, but an endless, blind, and irrational will. In the world as will and representation, this will is not a conscious desire or a personal decision. It represents the deeper force that appears in everything that tries to exist, survive, and assert itself. Before any rational thought takes place, life is already moving through impulse, need, effort, and constant struggle. Calling it irrational does not mean that the will makes mistakes in reasoning. It means something deeper. The will exists before reason and does not need to justify what it does. It does not ask whether a certain impulse is good, fair, or useful. It simply pushes living beings to keep wanting, searching, and struggling. That is why nature does not appear to Schopenhauer as a carefully organized system designed to create happiness. Animals hunt other animals. Living organisms compete for resources, and every form of life tries to preserve itself. The same force that keeps life going also creates conflict, because each individual constantly tries to maintain its own existence in a world filled with others doing the same. This view breaks with philosophies that see reality as a rational process moving toward some higher purpose. Schopenhauer rejects the idea that history necessarily moves toward something better. Wars, cruelty, and suffering are not simply stages of a good and meaningful plan, but expressions of the same will, constantly asserting itself. In human beings, this force takes much more complex forms. We do not compete only for food or shelter. We also seek status, recognition, power, influence, and approval. Intelligence creates complicated strategies to achieve these goals, but Schopenhauer suspects that reason often serves impulses that were already present inside us. A person may say they want wealth because they want security, but after reaching a comfortable level of financial stability, they may continue accumulating more. At that point, the rational explanation may no longer match the real impulse. The will changes the definition of what is necessary, raises expectations, and finds new reasons to keep the process going without ever accepting a final limit. The same thing happens in personal conflicts. Two people may argue for hours, believing that they are only defending principles, while pride, fear of losing authority, or resentment may quietly be driving the conversation. Reason provides arguments, examples, and accusations, but the emotional force behind the argument may come from a much less rational need to defeat the other person. This interpretation helps explain why knowing the best thing to do does not guarantee that we will do it. We can know that a habit is harming us and still repeat it. We can recognize that an ambition is damaging our health and still keep obeying it. Rational knowledge does not always have enough power to control what we want. Schopenhauer also sees sexuality as a powerful expression of the will. A person believes they are simply pursuing personal satisfaction, while the species continues itself through them. Here, his philosophy shows how our impulses can go far beyond the conscious explanations we give ourselves for why we want something. There is a disturbing consequence to this. Intelligence does not necessarily mean wisdom. We can use great rational ability to serve destructive goals. A strategist can carefully plan revenge. A ruler can organize oppression efficiently. Reason can improve the methods we use, but it does not guarantee that our goals are morally good. This helps explain why Schopenhauer considers it naive to believe that more knowledge will automatically create a better humanity. Knowledge can reduce ignorance, but it can also make the will more effective. Technology, organization, and intelligence increase our power. Without moral development, that power can be used to protect, exploit, care for, or destroy others. However, saying that the will dominates reality does not mean Schopenhauer believes we should passively obey our impulses. In fact, recognizing the power of the will helps explain why certain experiences can temporarily weaken its control. Art, compassion, and detachment appear as different ways of reducing the influence of individual desire. During aesthetic contemplation, for example, we temporarily stop judging everything according to usefulness, gain, or loss. In front of a work of art, we can simply observe. For Schopenhauer, this matters because consciousness stops working only as a tool of the will and experiences a less self-centered relationship with what exists before us. Compassion creates another break from the will. When another person's suffering becomes important to us, we stop acting only to protect our own interests. The other person is no longer seen simply as a competitor or a tool. This change weakens, even if only for a moment, the pattern in which each individual tries to place themselves above everyone else. This view also changes the way we understand freedom. Doing everything we want may seem like freedom, but if every desire controls us, then perhaps we are simply obeying the will very efficiently. Being free, in this sense, requires the ability to notice an impulse without immediately turning it into a command, a necessity, or something we believe we have no choice but to follow. Schopenhauer's philosophy does not promise complete control over this force. What it offers first is awareness, understanding that intensity does not equal truth, that wanting something does not prove that it is valuable, and that having good reasons on the surface does not guarantee that our deeper motivations are equally reasonable, conscious, or justified. To see the world as an expression of an irrational will, then, is to recognize that reality was not designed to satisfy our ideals. That conclusion may be difficult, but it also makes it more important to examine what drives us, because real thinking begins when we stop treating every impulse as something that automatically has authority over our lives. There are moments when a painting, a poem, or a play can do something that no rational argument can achieve. For a while, it interrupts the pressure of everyday life and shifts our attention toward an experience that does not demand an immediate response. This is where Schopenhauer finds real relief through art. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer says that art has a rare ability. It can temporarily suspend the control of the will. When we look at something without seeking usefulness, advantage, ownership, or reward, we briefly stop organizing the world only around our personal desires and immediate needs. In everyday life, almost everything passes through the filter of self-interest. We look at people, objects, places, and events while asking consciously or unconsciously what they can offer us, threaten, make easier, or prevent. The will turns reality into a field of needs, and the mind usually works constantly to satisfy those demands. Art changes this relationship. When a work truly captures our attention, we do not immediately need to buy it, control it, use it, or turn it into some kind of personal advantage. We can simply look, listen, read, or follow what is happening. This seemingly simple act briefly reduces the power of desire over us. Imagine someone walking into a museum after a difficult day. Their mind is full of responsibilities, messages, bills, and decisions that still need to be made. Suddenly, a painting completely captures their attention. For a few minutes, their problems still exist, but they no longer take up their entire mind. For Schopenhauer, this is not just distraction. Distraction means temporarily replacing one discomfort with another form of stimulation. Aesthetic contemplation goes further because it changes the way we pay attention. Instead of looking for personal satisfaction, we remain focused on the work without immediately turning it into something that serves our everyday interests. That is why art has such a special place in Schopenhauer's philosophy. It offers a kind of break that is different from the relief we feel when a desire is satisfied. When we eat because we are hungry, pleasure removes a need. Through art, we can experience something intense without having a specific need that must be satisfied. This difference matters because ordinary pleasure usually keeps the cycle of desire going. A need appears. We try to satisfy it. We feel relief, and then another need takes its place. In a deep aesthetic experience, something unusual happens. Instead of simply satisfying the will, we temporarily reduce its pressure on our minds. This helps explain why a sad work of art can sometimes bring comfort. A melancholy song does not have to erase our sadness in order to help us. It can give shape to the feeling, organize what seemed confusing, and allow us to observe the emotion without being completely trapped inside it. Tragedy is especially important in this sense. By watching characters face loss, ambition, conflict, and failure, the audience observes universal forms of suffering. They are not literally living that story, but they recognize something in it about the human condition. This distance allows them to understand pain without being personally overwhelmed by it. There is an interesting connection here with Aristotle, although the two philosophers take different paths. In Poetics, Aristotle connects tragedy with emotions such as pity and fear. Schopenhauer focuses more on the suspension of the will, but both recognize that art has a unique power to change the way we experience human suffering. Literature offers another example. A novel can put into words something a person has never been able to explain. Loneliness, guilt, grief, fear, or failure. When a private experience is given language, it no longer feels completely isolated. The reader begins to see that personal feelings are also part of the wider possibilities of human existence. This transformation does not remove real problems. After closing the book, leaving the theater, or walking out of an exhibition, the difficulties may still be exactly where they were. Schopenhauer does not present art as a permanent cure. Its value lies in the relief it offers within a life that is usually ruled by need and personal interest. Nature can also create this kind of experience when we look at it aesthetically. A mountain stops being an obstacle, a resource, or a piece of property and becomes something we simply observe. The same can happen with the ocean, a tree, or the sky when we stop asking what practical use they have for us. This state temporarily reduces the importance of the ego. Much of everyday suffering is connected to thoughts such as my problems, my losses, my goals, my fears. During deep contemplation, that center can become weaker. The person still exists, but for a while, they stop judging everything according to their own personal story. That is why Schopenhauer speaks of the pure subject of knowledge. The phrase may sound technical, but it describes a very real experience, seeing something without immediately wanting to possess or use it. In that state, the mind stops working only as a servant of the will and gains a brief but meaningful kind of independence. This idea also separates art from automatic entertainment. Entertainment may simply fill an empty space and keep us from feeling bored. A genuine aesthetic experience requires attention. It does not necessarily numb us. It can do the opposite. It can deepen our awareness without turning everything we feel into desire, consumption, or escape. Perhaps the deepest value of art lies exactly here. It does not promise to rearrange the world according to our wishes. Instead, for a few moments, it changes our relationship with wanting itself. Suffering becomes less central because we temporarily stop demanding that every moment satisfy some immediate or future need. Among all the arts, music holds a special place for Schopenhauer. It does not simply represent emotions, landscapes, or events. It reaches directly into what he sees as the deepest foundation of reality. In the world as will and representation, music appears as a unique expression of the will itself, the force that lies behind existence. The difference between music and the other arts is important. A painting shows visible forms. Sculpture presents physical bodies. Literature organizes characters, images, and actions. Music, however, does not need to copy any specific object. Even without words, it can create tension, rest, expectation, sadness, movement, and a feeling of resolution. This fascinates Schopenhauer because a melody seems to speak to us before we form any clear idea about it. We may know nothing about music theory and still feel that a certain passage is building, hesitating, searching for something, or finally coming to rest. The understanding happens immediately, almost physically, as if the sound reaches a level deeper than conscious thought. To understand this idea, we need to remember what Schopenhauer means by the will. It is not a conscious choice, but a blind and endless force that appears in desire, struggle, survival, and the constant search for satisfaction. Music, in his view, expresses the same basic movement through sound. A melody moves forward because it creates a relationship between tension and rest. Certain notes seem to demand continuation. Some harmonies create expectation. Certain passages seem to resist reaching an ending. When a resolution finally arrives, we feel relief. Schopenhauer sees this as a powerful comparison with the way our desires appear. Face obstacles, continue pushing forward, and search for satisfaction. That is why music does not describe one particular desire. It does not necessarily tell the story of someone wanting money, love, or recognition. Instead, it expresses the general form of wanting itself. Movement, difficulty, hope, frustration, struggle, and rest. This is exactly what allows music to connect with so many different human experiences. Two people can listen to the same piece of music and connect it with completely different stories. One remembers a loss. Another thinks about a major change. Another simply feels an emotion that is difficult to explain. This happens because music does not always give us one specific meaning. It gives us emotional patterns that each person can recognize within themselves. This is where Schopenhauer places music above the other arts. Painting, poetry, and sculpture still represent what he calls ideas, the essential forms through which the will appears in the world. Music, according to him, has a more direct connection. It does not copy the appearances of the world, but expresses the deeper force behind them. This helps explain why he sees music as almost a universal language of existence. It can communicate something about the movement of desire without having to show any specific object. The listener recognizes movement, conflict, and resolution because these same patterns are part of their own experience of wanting, suffering, waiting, losing, and beginning again. There is also an important difference between explaining an emotion and making someone feel it. Philosophy can analyze anxiety by describing its causes and effects. Music, however, can create tension without ever defining what anxiety is. The body feels the movement before the mind finds the words to explain it. This helps us understand the physical power of music. A rhythm can change our sense of energy. A shift in harmony can give us chills, and a melody can change our emotional state without making any argument at all. Schopenhauer sees this immediate response as a sign that music reaches parts of our being that come before rational thought. That is why music appears at funerals, ceremonies, celebrations, protests, and romantic moments. When words feel insufficient, we turn to sound. Not because music gives us better explanations, but because it can organize emotions we still do not know how to name, giving confused feelings a form, rhythm, and direction we can experience. Sad music provides an especially interesting example. If sadness were simply something we always wanted to remove, it would seem strange to listen to melancholy songs when we are already suffering. Yet they can bring comfort. Instead of erasing the pain, they transform the experience of it, giving shape and expression to something that previously felt scattered inside us. At that moment, an aesthetic distance appears. We are still feeling the emotion, but we are no longer completely trapped inside the personal situation that caused it. Sadness itself becomes something we can observe. For Schopenhauer, this movement from directly experiencing suffering to contemplating its form temporarily weakens the pressure of the will on our individual consciousness. The experience of music, then, has two sides. It reveals the structure of wanting, while also temporarily freeing us from that wanting. We hear tension, movement, and resolution without having to turn those experiences into real needs. The will becomes something we can hear, while for a short time we stop directly obeying it within ourselves. This also shows why truly listening to music is different from using it only as background noise. Contemplation requires attention. When music completely absorbs us, our practical worries, comparisons, and calculations can fade for a while. The world stops appearing only as a collection of personal problems, obstacles, and opportunities. Schopenhauer does not claim that music can permanently eliminate suffering. Once the piece ends, our desires may return with full force. Still, this temporary freedom has great philosophical importance, because it shows that consciousness does not always have to remain trapped in constant searching, possession, competition, and the satisfaction of needs. This is what makes music so extraordinary in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Through sound, it allows us to experience the deeper pattern that we normally live as desire and conflict. While we listen, the force that usually controls us can become something we contemplate, revealing a reality that we can feel, even before we are able to fully explain it in words. What truly makes an action moral? Following a rule or feeling that another person's suffering matters? Schopenhauer chooses the second answer. And on the basis of morality, he argues that true morality begins when we are able to step, at least partly, outside the closed circle of our own personal interests. This idea begins with a criticism of selfishness. Each person experiences their own pain directly, while they see the suffering of others from the outside. Because of that, it is natural to give more importance to what happens to us. The problem begins when this difference turns into indifference toward the pain of others. Compassion breaks through this barrier. For Schopenhauer, compassion is not simply pity or sentimentality. It is the ability to recognize another person's suffering so directly that it begins to influence the way we act. At that moment, we stop asking only what we will gain or lose from the situation. Imagine two people helping someone who is injured. The first helps because they want to look generous in front of others. The second helps because they see the person's pain and cannot treat it as something unimportant. From the outside, the two actions may look similar. Morally, however, Schopenhauer sees their motives as deeply different. If the main motivation is still reputation, reward, or personal advantage, then the ego remains at the center. True compassion appears when another person's suffering becomes enough of a reason to act. I do not help because it makes me look good. I help because the pain in front of me matters on its own. That is why Schopenhauer rejects a morality based only on abstract rules. A person can follow rules because they fear punishment or because it benefits them. They may behave properly while being watched and act cruelly when they believe no one will find out. Morality must reach our inner motivation. At this point, his view differs from Kant's. Kant bases moral value on duty and respect for rational moral law. Schopenhauer sees this explanation as too abstract. For him, what truly interrupts selfishness is not simply a rational rule, but the real experience of recognizing another person's vulnerability. From compassion, Schopenhauer identifies two basic forms of morality. The first is justice. I hold myself back and avoid causing suffering. The second is kindness. I go beyond simply avoiding harm and try to relieve another person's pain when I am able to do so. Justice, then, begins with placing a limit on our own self-interest. Maybe I could deceive someone and gain an advantage, but I recognize the harm I would cause. Maybe I could humiliate someone weaker without facing consequences, but I choose not to. The other person stops being just a tool for my own goals. Kindness goes one step further. It is not enough to avoid causing harm. There is also a willingness to help. This can appear in simple actions: listening to someone who is struggling, offering support during a difficult time, protecting someone who is vulnerable, or giving up an advantage when it clearly depends on exploiting another person. This idea is directly connected to Schopenhauer's metaphysics. If all individuals are expressions of the same will, then the absolute separation between me and others belongs to the world of appearances. Compassion becomes a kind of intuitive understanding that this separation does not represent the whole truth of existence. That is why, when someone suffers, we are not looking at a completely foreign reality. Fear, loss, pain, and vulnerability are part of a shared human condition. We may never have lived through exactly what that person is experiencing, but we know within ourselves what it means to be capable of suffering. That shared possibility brings people morally closer together. This view also explains why Schopenhauer extends compassion beyond human beings. He strongly criticized cruelty toward animals. If a living being is capable of suffering, then its pain matters morally. There is no good philosophical reason to treat its suffering as meaningless simply because it belongs to another species. This makes his ethics especially important. Instead of asking only whether a being belongs to our group, Schopenhauer focuses on its ability to feel pain. Compassion breaks through boundaries created by ego, culture, and self-interest by recognizing that vulnerability is not limited only to human beings or to people within our own social circle. In everyday life, however, this openness faces many obstacles. We are more easily affected by the suffering of people we know. We may feel deep empathy for a friend while remaining emotionally distant from strangers. Schopenhauer's morality challenges us to notice how the ego chooses which kinds of suffering deserve our attention. Distance also makes indifference easier. When we cannot see someone's face, we may forget that there is a real person there who can feel pain. This becomes especially clear online, where cruel words can be written in seconds. The person sending them sees only a screen. The person receiving them may carry the hurt for a long time. Compassion requires us to imagine consequences that we do not directly feel ourselves. Before humiliating, exploiting, or hurting someone, it introduces a question. What will this action do to the other person? That simple question can become a powerful limit against the blind expression of our own individual will. This does not mean that being compassionate means accepting everything. Compassion does not remove responsibility, judgment, or the need to set boundaries. We can recognize someone's suffering while still preventing that person from causing more harm. Understanding someone's pain does not automatically justify every action that comes from it. It also does not mean turning our entire life into constant self-sacrifice. Schopenhauer values moving beyond selfishness, not thoughtlessly destroying ourselves. The main point is to stop acting as if only our own needs are real. Compassion means recognizing that there are many different people experiencing life, pain, and vulnerability. There is an important consequence here. Morality does not depend only on great heroic actions. It appears constantly in small decisions. Choosing not to use personal information to embarrass someone, not taking advantage of a weakness, not turning an argument into an opportunity for humiliation, and not ignoring someone when we are able to help, are all real examples of compassionate behavior. In a philosophy deeply focused on suffering, compassion offers an important moral response. We cannot prevent every loss, illness, or frustration that life brings, but we can avoid adding unnecessary suffering to the world. That difference is our responsibility in a way that many other events are simply not completely under our control. For Schopenhauer, then, morality begins when the rigid boundary of the ego becomes weaker. The other person stops being part of the background of our life and appears as someone who also feels. At that moment, the question changes from only, "What do I want?" to, "How much suffering could what I want cause someone else?" We do not always suffer only because we lose something. Many times, we suffer before the loss even happens, simply because we are afraid it might happen. This is where detachment becomes important in Schopenhauer's philosophy. The more we turn something into an absolute requirement for our peace of mind, the more vulnerable we become to the possibility of losing it. In The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer shows that suffering is deeply connected to wanting. We want to possess, preserve, control, and guarantee things. When we get something important, the will does not necessarily become calm. In many cases, it simply changes form. First, we want to achieve something. Then we begin to fear losing it. Attachment comes from this need for permanence. We love someone and want that person to stay with us. We build a career and want to protect it. We achieve stability and want to prevent anything from changing. The problem is that reality does not offer absolute guarantees. Everything that exists in time is subject to change. That is why detachment does not mean that we stop loving or become indifferent. That would be a shallow interpretation. Detachment means reducing the emotional dependence that turns people, possessions, or positions into absolute conditions for living well. We can deeply value something without believing that our entire existence depends on it lasting forever. Think about someone whose identity is completely tied to their job. As long as their career is going well, they feel secure. But any criticism, layoff, or failure begins to threaten not only their income, but also their entire sense of self-worth. The suffering becomes greater because work is no longer just an important part of life. It has become everything. The same thing can happen in relationships. Loving someone can be one of the most meaningful experiences in life. But when love turns into possession, a different pattern begins. A person starts watching, controlling, demanding guarantees, and seeing any independence from the other person as a threat. Attachment then begins to suffocate the very thing it was trying to protect. Schopenhauer understands that the will wants stability in a world that is naturally unstable. It wants to say, "This is mine, and it must remain mine." But people change, circumstances change, bodies grow older, and relationships can end. The more rigidly we demand permanence, the greater the shock when we face the reality of change. In this sense, Schopenhauer found important similarities with Eastern traditions, especially Buddhism. Without treating the two philosophies as identical, there is a clear point of connection. Attachment to impermanent things increases suffering. When we treat temporary things as if they were permanent, we begin fighting against the basic nature of reality itself. Detachment, then, does not remove change. It changes our relationship with it. A person can take care of their health without believing they can prevent aging forever. They can save money without believing it will make the future completely safe. They can love deeply without treating the other person as property. In all of these cases, there is commitment, but not the illusion of total control. The same idea applies to other people's opinions. Someone who depends too much on approval lives in a constant state of alert. One criticism can ruin an entire day. One compliment can become necessary to restore their self-esteem. The person starts changing decisions, words, and appearance in order to protect an image they can never fully control. Detachment does not mean ignoring everything other people think. Some criticism is useful, and human relationships require mutual consideration. The difference is refusing to let outside approval completely define our identity. When approval loses that absolute power, it also loses some of its ability to cause suffering. There is an important difference between valuing something and depending on it. To value something means recognizing its importance. To depend on it completely means believing that without it, peace is impossible. That difference may seem small, but it completely changes our experience. A person can want professional success while still knowing that their worth is not limited to their job title. They can enjoy comfort without turning every possession into part of their identity. They can hope that a relationship lasts while also recognizing that no human relationship can be guaranteed forever. This kind of detachment creates a sense of freedom because it reduces the number of things that must happen exactly the way we want them to. The more conditions we create for being at peace, the more fragile our peace becomes. I'll only be okay if this continues. I'll only be happy if this person stays. I'll only have value if people keep recognizing me. Each of these thoughts gives part of our peace to something we cannot completely control. Schopenhauer also connects this issue with renunciation. In the more radical side of his philosophy, reducing desires and needs can be a way of weakening the will itself. This does not have to mean supporting poverty or deprivation. The point is not that we suffer less simply because we own fewer things, but because we psychologically need less. That difference is essential. Someone may own very little and still be deeply attached to what they have. Another person may own a great deal and have a much freer relationship with their possessions. The philosophical problem is not simply how many things we own, but how much emotional power we give them. When something becomes essential to our identity, we begin living under a constant sense of threat. Detachment can also help us experience the present more fully. This may sound strange, but it makes sense. Someone who is too focused on keeping something rarely manages to simply enjoy it. A person finally achieves stability but immediately starts thinking about everything that could destroy it. They find a happy relationship, but begin imagining abandonment. They gain recognition, but become afraid of being forgotten. Attachment turns a good experience into an expectation of future loss. In this sense, holding on too tightly can prevent us from truly living what we are trying to protect. Detachment means accepting that value and permanence are not the same thing. Something can be precious, even if it does not last forever. A relationship can be meaningful, even if it changes. A period of life can still have value even after it ends. This understanding removes an impossible demand from reality, the demand that everything we love remain unchanged forever. It is also important not to confuse detachment with emotional numbness. Becoming unable to feel is not freedom. Schopenhauer is interested in reducing the control of the will, not turning human beings into emotionless objects. The real challenge is remaining able to love without trying to possess, to build without demanding absolute guarantees, and to desire without turning every desire into a necessity. Living this way requires constant awareness, because the will is always trying to turn preferences into demands. When we notice this happening, we can ask ourselves, is this really necessary for my peace? Or am I giving something outside of me more power than it should have? Maybe detachment begins with that question. It does not promise to prevent loss, failure, or change. What it can do is reduce the suffering created by trying to stop what cannot be stopped. And the less we need the world to remain exactly the way we want it to, the more room we have to move through change without treating every transformation as a threat to our own existence. When each person begins to see the world only through their own interests, other people stop appearing as complete individuals and start to look like obstacles, tools, or competitors. For Schopenhauer, reducing others in this way is one of the main sources of suffering created by human beings themselves. And on the basis of morality, Schopenhauer describes selfishness as a force deeply rooted in human behavior. Each person feels their own pain directly, knows their own desires from the inside, and experiences their own needs as urgent. The suffering of others, however, is seen from the outside, which creates a kind of emotional imbalance. My pain feels immediate. Yours has to be imagined. It is exactly in this difference that selfishness finds room to grow. When a person considers only what benefits their own life, the well-being of others becomes less important. The question is no longer, is this fair? But simply, does this benefit me? This can appear in very ordinary situations. Someone wants to move ahead in their career and starts hiding important information from coworkers. Another person wants recognition and puts down someone else's work in order to look superior. Someone else notices another person's weakness and uses it to gain a personal advantage. None of these actions require physical violence. Selfishness can be quiet, polite, and even socially acceptable. Schopenhauer believes that the individual will constantly tries to assert itself. It wants to survive, expand, and get what it desires. When one person's will comes up against another person's will, conflict begins. Two people may want the same position, the same resource, the same attention, or simply the right to control a certain situation. If neither of them can see beyond their own interests, the other person begins to look like an enemy. This helps explain why so many conflicts become more aggressive than they need to be. The original issue may be small, but the ego turns the situation into a fight over personal importance. It is no longer enough to solve the problem. Someone has to win, prove superiority, humiliate the other person, or make sure the other person is wrong. At that point, suffering stops being an unavoidable part of life and becomes something deliberately created by one person against another. This distinction is essential in Schopenhauer's philosophy. There are forms of pain we cannot completely eliminate: illness, aging, loss, and death. But there is also a huge amount of suffering added by cruelty, exploitation, indifference, and the human need to dominate. Selfishness adds even more suffering to a world that already has plenty of it. Think about a family argument. Two people could try to understand the problem, but each one is focused only on protecting their own image. No one truly listens. Every sentence becomes a weapon, every memory becomes an accusation, and old wounds are brought back only to cause more pain. When that happens, truth is no longer the center of the conversation. The ego wants to win. Schopenhauer would say that this need to assert ourselves shows how much our relationships with others can be controlled by the will. Instead of seeing another conscious human being, we see only something standing in the way of what we want. This pattern also appears in the search for status. Someone who builds their identity around comparison constantly needs to measure who is above and who is below them. Another person's success can feel threatening even when nothing has actually been taken away. Envy grows easily in this kind of environment. The other person stops being someone whose achievement can simply be recognized and begins to represent a symbolic loss of our own value. The result is a double form of suffering. The person who is attacked, put down, or sabotaged suffers, but the person who is constantly comparing also suffers. Someone controlled by competition rarely finds peace. There is always someone richer, more admired, more attractive, more influential, or apparently happier. Selfishness, then, has not only hurt others, it also traps the selfish person. Someone who constantly thinks about protecting their advantages has to keep watching the world. Someone who depends on feeling superior is always afraid of losing their position. Someone who manipulates relationships has to control information. Someone who turns everything into competition lives surrounded by possible rivals. The search for advantage can end up creating a life filled with distrust. This becomes even more serious when another person is reduced to how useful they are. A friendship may continue only as long as it provides useful connections. A relationship may exist only as long as it satisfies emotional needs. A worker may be valued while they produce results and discarded as soon as they are no longer useful. In these cases, human beings are treated as tools. Despite important differences, this criticism brings Schopenhauer close to a concern also found in Kant. Kant argues that we should treat humanity as an end and never simply as a means. Schopenhauer rejects Kant's rational foundation, but he shares the idea that completely turning another person into a tool destroys morality. For Schopenhauer, however, the real solution is not just a rule. It is compassion. Compassion weakens selfishness because it allows another person's suffering to become meaningful to us. When we truly understand that the person in front of us feels fear, shame, insecurity, and pain, it becomes harder to reduce them to an object. The question changes again. Instead of thinking only, "What can I get from this?" we begin to ask, "What will my actions do to this person?" That change can affect decisions that seem small. Someone may be able to make a humiliating joke and get laughs, but they realize the embarrassment it would cause. Someone may be able to use another person's mistake to get ahead at work, but they recognize the unnecessary harm. Someone may be able to respond to an insult with even greater cruelty, but they decide to stop the cycle. Morality begins exactly where the will meets a limit. This does not mean giving up our own interests. Schopenhauer does not require anyone to allow themselves to be exploited in order to prove they are compassionate. We can protect ourselves, set boundaries, and refuse abuse without turning the other person into an object of revenge. There is a difference between defending yourself and enjoying hurting someone, between seeking justice and wanting humiliation, between setting boundaries and trying to destroy someone. The ego often tries to erase these differences. Distance also makes cruelty easier. When we do not directly see the person who will suffer because of our choices, it becomes easier to forget their humanity. This happens in economic, social, and digital relationships. Behind a screen, Someone may write words they would never say face to face to a person who is crying. Not seeing the person's face makes the pain easier to ignore, but the pain is still real. This is exactly why Schopenhauer's ethics still feels relevant today. Morality requires us to take seriously suffering that we do not feel in our own bodies. Another person's pain does not become smaller just because it is far away. One of the ego's greatest illusions is believing that what does not directly affect us barely exists. Breaking that illusion means recognizing that every person carries an inner world just as intense as our own. When that understanding becomes stronger, the ego is no longer the only center of reality. And maybe that is the most important change. Understanding that reducing human suffering does not always require great heroic actions. Often, it begins with something much simpler and much harder. Refusing an advantage when getting it depends on making another person suffer unnecessarily. After exploring the entire cycle of desire, Schopenhauer reaches the most radical point in his philosophy. Maybe freedom does not come from satisfying the will more effectively, but from weakening its control over us. If endless wanting creates suffering, then breaking that control requires learning not to automatically obey every impulse. In the world as will and representation, denying the will does not mean hating life, wanting to disappear, or seeking suffering. It means an inner transformation in which a person becomes less identified with desires, ambitions, possessions, and demands that once seemed absolutely necessary for living. Everyday thinking often tells us that we will be free once we get what we want. Schopenhauer turns this idea around. A person who can satisfy every impulse may seem powerful, but they are still controlled by those impulses. A deeper kind of freedom begins when wanting something does not mean having to chase it or possess it. This difference is important because the will turns preferences into needs. A person no longer thinks, "I would like this," but instead, "I need this in order to be okay." The more desires are given this kind of power, the more dependent we become on outside circumstances, and the harder it becomes to remain at peace. Imagine someone who has built their entire identity around recognition. Every compliment confirms their value. Every criticism seems to reduce it. The person believes they are chasing success, but they may actually be feeding a need that will never accept any amount of approval as enough. Denying the will begins when this pattern is recognized. In this case, giving something up does not mean quitting work or rejecting all recognition. It means removing an impossible responsibility from those things. The responsibility of proving once and for all who we are. A career can still matter, but it no longer has to support our entire identity. This change reduces the power that success and failure have over our minds. The same applies to material possessions. Owning something is not the main problem. Suffering increases when possession becomes part of the ego, and losing it feels like a threat to our very existence. Schopenhauer sees voluntary simplicity as one way of reducing unnecessary forms of dependence in everyday life. His admiration for Indian traditions and Buddhism helps explain this direction. Although we should not treat these different systems as the same, Schopenhauer saw in these traditions a powerful criticism of attachment. As long as we insist on holding on to things that change, we create a conflict between our demand for permanence and the temporary nature of reality. The denial of the will is also connected to asceticism. In its most extreme form, an ascetic reduces pleasures, possessions, and impulses in order to weaken individual desire. The point is not simply to suffer on purpose, but to stop feeding a force that turns every satisfaction into another desire. This point requires care because Schopenhauer does not consider suicide a true denial of the will. For him, a suicidal person may reject the specific conditions of life precisely because they still strongly desire a different kind of existence. The will is still active. It is simply frustrated by the circumstances it has encountered. True denial moves in a different direction. Instead of destroying the individual, because their desires were not satisfied, it tries to weaken the need to demand satisfaction itself. This means reducing attachment, vanity, competition, and the need for control, allowing the mind to depend less on the outside world, doing exactly what we want. Compassion is also part of this process. When we seriously recognize another person's suffering, the ego stops being the only center of reality. We may give up an advantage, hold back from cruelty, or walk away from a conflict because we realize that our own desires do not have absolute value over the desires and well-being of others. That is also why denying the will does not mean becoming morally indifferent. In fact, the less controlled we are by the ego, the more capable we may become of noticing the needs of others. Reducing personal desire can create room for a less competitive, possessive, and self-centered relationship with other living beings. Art offers a temporary experience in the same direction. During aesthetic contemplation, we do not need to possess what we see or turn it into a personal benefit. For a few moments, we stop organizing everything around gain and loss. This pause shows that constant wanting does not have to control every moment of consciousness. Art, however, offers only temporary relief. When the experience ends, our needs return. A deeper denial of the will requires a more lasting change in our relationship with desire. A person learns to notice impulses without immediately giving all of them authority over their choices and actions. This possibility changes the meaning of freedom. We usually call someone free when they can do whatever they want. Schopenhauer asks us to consider another possibility. Maybe a freer person is someone who can want something intensely and still not be automatically dragged along by that desire, especially when following it would lead to harmful consequences. Denying the will can begin with actions much smaller than extreme asceticism. Not responding to every provocation, not turning envy into competition, not making approval a necessity, and accepting that some losses cannot be controlled can already weaken the endless need of the ego to assert itself. Schopenhauer's idea of freedom does not promise a world without pain. It points toward a way of living in which some suffering is no longer fueled by the demand that everything must satisfy our desires. When the will loses some of its power, the mind discovers a rare kind of peace, needing less in order to live. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me through this entire reflection. Schopenhauer may seem harsh, pessimistic, and even uncomfortable, but maybe that is exactly why his philosophy still challenges so many people. He does not try to convince us that life will always be pleasant. He forces us to look directly at desire, loss, dissatisfaction, and suffering without hiding these experiences behind easy promises. And maybe the big question we are left with is this: suffering may be unavoidable, but do we really need to make it worse by obeying every desire, every attachment, and every demand of our own ego? I want to know what you think. After learning more about Schopenhauer's ideas, do you believe he was too pessimistic, or do you think there is a deeper truth in the way he describes human existence? Leave your opinion in the comments, because this discussion can go far beyond this video. If this content made you think, like the video, it helps the channel reach more people who are interested in philosophy, and it also shows that you want to see more videos like this. And if you are not subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next videos. Here, we keep exploring the ideas of the great philosophers, not only to understand their theories, but also to see how they can change the way we look at life, our choices, and even ourselves. Share this video with someone who also enjoys philosophy, or with that person who is always saying they just need to achieve one more thing before they can finally be happy. Maybe Schopenhauer has a few interesting questions for them too. Thank you again for being here, and don't leave the channel just yet. Stay here and choose one of the next videos to take your philosophical reflection even further. See you in the next one.